The wind did not merely blow in the high country of the Wyoming Territory. It hunted. It screamed through the teeth of the granite peaks, searching for anything warm enough to kill. It stripped the snow from the ridgelines in long, smoking banners of white dust and piled it deep in the coulees, enough to swallow a horse whole. Elias pushed his gelding through a drift that reached the animal's chest. The horse, a big roan with a coat like wire wool, snorted and fought for footing, its breath exploding in steam clouds that froze instantly on its muzzle. Elias patted the beast's neck with a mittened hand the size of a shovel head. He did not speak. Words were a waste of heat up here, and Elias had not spoken to another human being in 3 months. He was a giant of a man, standing 6 feet and 4 inches in his stocking feet, broader across the shoulders than a door frame. He wore a coat of buffalo hide with the fur turned inside, greased to turn the wet, and over that, a heavy woolen blanket poncho. His beard was a thicket of iron gray and black, matted with ice where his breath had caught. Underneath the furs, he carried the scars of 40 years of hard living, claw marks from a grizzly on his ribs, a musket ball divot in his thigh from the Mexican War, and other, deeper marks that did not show on his skin. He was checking his trap line along the upper creek, a frozen ribbon of water that snaked through the timber. The beaver had been good this season, their pelts thick and dark, prime for the trade. He dismounted heavily, breaking through the crust of the snow, and checked a set beneath a shelf of ice, empty. He reset the trap with practiced, fluid movements, his large fingers nimble despite the numbing cold. He was mounting up to ride to the next draw when he saw them. Tracks. Elias froze, his hand instinctively going to the stock of the Hawken rifle scabbarded under his leg. He studied the white expanse of the slope. The wind usually scrubbed the world clean within the hour, but in the shelter of a limestone overhang, the impressions remained. They were faint, uneven, and wrong. They were not the confident, plunging tracks of a deer, nor the wide, padding prints of a cat. They were not wolf tracks, though a large timber wolf had crossed the line recently, likely stalking the same scent. They were boot prints, but small. Too small for a man, too small for a woman. Elias frowned, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his battered hat. He nudged the roan forward, following the trail down a rocky draw where the scrub pine twisted out of the stone like tortured iron. The tracks told a story of exhaustion. One set dragged the left foot, the other set weaved back and forth, sometimes dropping to hands and knees before rising again. He found them a mile down the drainage, huddled in the lee of a fallen ponderosa pine. At first, they looked like a pile of refuse, a heap of discarded rags and a half-burnt trade blanket dusted with snow. But as Elias's shadow fell over them, the pile shifted. 2 heads popped up, eyes wide and white in faces dark with grime and cold. They were children, twins, by the look of them, a boy and a girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. They were native, their hair chopped short in mourning or desperation, wearing buckskins that were torn and thin. They were freezing to death. The boy scrambled backward, dragging the girl with him, pressing their backs against the rough bark of the dead tree. The girl made a high, keening sound, like a trapped rabbit. The boy reached for a stick lying in the snow, wielding it like a knife, his hand trembling so violently he could barely hold it. Elias sat on his horse, looking down at them. He felt a heavy stone of annoyance settle in his gut. This was not what he wanted. He wanted beaver plews. He wanted silence. He did not want to find 2 half-dead children in the middle of a killing winter. "Easy now," Elias rumbled. His voice was like rocks grinding together, rusty from disuse. The twins flinched at the sound. The boy shouted something in a dialect Elias recognized as a blend of the mountain tongues, but the wind tore the words away. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Elias said, swinging his leg over the saddle and dropping into the snow. The snow crunched under his boots. The children screamed. To them, this man must have looked like a monster, a towering heap of furs and hair, armed with a rifle long enough to touch the ground, smelling of blood and musk. "Blue coats," the girl whispered, the English words distinct and terrified. "No blue coats." Elias stopped. He raised his empty hands. showing his palms. "No blue coats here, little ones. Just me, just a trapper." He took a step closer, and the boy jabbed the stick at him. "Stay!" the boy cried out. "Trade! We trade!" Elias paused, confused. The boy was shivering so hard his teeth clicked together audibly. His lips were the color of bruised plums. "Trade what?" Elias asked softly. "You got nothing, son. You are freezing. Don't take us to them," the girl begged. She spoke better English than the boy, though the words were fractured. "Don't take to the fort. Don't take to the soldiers. We trade. We work." Elias looked at them, really looked at them, and saw the terror that went deeper than the cold. He saw the way their moccasins were shredded, wrapped in strips of raw hide. He saw the soot smeared on their faces, the smell of smoke still clinging to them. "What happened?" Elias asked. The girl choked on a sob. "Soldiers came to the lodges. Morning time. They shoot the ponies. They burn the winter meat." Elias closed his eyes for a second. It was an old story. The army was clearing the foothills again, pushing the bands onto the reservations, or simply pushing them into the grave. "Luta fight," the boy said, his voice cracking. "Luta fight them." "Who is Luta?" "Sister," the girl whispered. "Big sister." She hit the soldier with a fire stick. "They took her, dragged her on the horse. We run fast." Elias looked at the vast, empty white horizon. They must have run for days to get this high up. It was a miracle the wolves hadn't taken them, or the cold hadn't stopped their hearts 2 nights ago. He unhooked a canteen from his saddle and a pouch of dried meat. He knelt in the snow, keeping a respectful distance. "Here, chew on this." The boy hesitated, eyeing the meat like a starving dog, then snatched it. He tore a piece off with his teeth and handed the rest to his sister before he swallowed. Elias watched them eat. His mind was already working through the logistics. The nearest settlement was the fort, 3 days' ride to the south if the weather held, which it wouldn't. The humane thing, the sensible thing, was to bundle them up, put them on the horse, and ride them down to the Indian agent at the fort. Let the army clean up its own mess. Let the civilization that claimed to be taming this land take care of its orphans. He stood up, brushing snow from his knees. "All right," he said. "Come on. I will take you down to the soldier fort. They got warm fires there. They got blankets." The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The twins threw themselves at his legs, not to attack, but to anchor him. They clung to his heavy fur trousers, burying their faces in the buffalo hide. "No!" the boy screamed. "No soldier fort! They kill! They kill! Trade!" The girl wept, looking up at him, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Trade your big skins. Trade your horse. You keep us. We work. We hide. Do not give to blue coats." Elias looked down at the small hands gripping him. The desperation in their voices clawed at something inside him, something he had buried under years of solitude and whiskey. Trade. The word echoed in his head, sharp and ugly. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in the snow in Wyoming. He was standing in a dusty plaza in Mexico. 20 years ago, the sun was hot enough to melt lead. A Mexican officer was holding a pistol to Elias's head, and another man, a boy really, a private from Tennessee, was on his knees beside him. "One lives, one dies," the officer had said in Spanish. "You choose, big man. Trade your life for his." Elias had chosen. He had walked away, and the boy from Tennessee had not. The shame of that moment had never left him. It was the reason he lived where the air was thin and the people were few. It was the reason he never looked a man in the eye for too long. He had traded a life for his own survival. Now, these 2 scraps of humanity were begging him to do a different kind of trade. They wanted him to trade his peace, his safety, and his solitude for their lives. They were offering themselves as slaves to a trapper rather than go back to the men who were supposed to protect them. Elias looked at the gray sky. A storm was coming. He could feel the pressure dropping in his ears. If he tried to make the fort now, they would all die in the pass. He looked down at the twins. "Get up," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. They did not move, staring at him with the paralyzed eyes of deer. "I said get up," Elias barked. "I ain't taking you to the soldiers. Not today." He reached down and scooped the girl up in one arm. She was light as a bird skeleton. He grabbed the boy by the collar of his tunic and hauled him upright. "You ride," Elias said to the girl, depositing her in his saddle. "You hold on to the horn and don't let go." He looked at the boy. "You walk with me until the blood gets moving. Then we switch. Can you walk?" The boy nodded, his jaw set. "We are going to my cabin," Elias said. "It is up the ridge. If you fall behind, the wolves get you. If you cry, the cold gets you. You understand?" "Yes," the boy whispered. The trek back to the cabin was a brutal, lung-burning slog. The wind shifted, coming straight out of the north, driving ice pellets that stung like birdshot. Elias walked at the horse's head, breaking the trail with his own body. He kept a hand on the boy's shoulder, half guiding, half dragging him when his small legs stumbled. The cold was a physical weight. Elias could feel his own beard freezing to his scarf. The girl on the horse was a lump of misery, wrapped in Elias's spare blanket, her head bowed against the gale. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, long and mournful. The horse pinned its ears back and danced sideways. "Steady," Elias growled, gripping the bridle. He looked at the boy. The kid was stumbling with every step, his eyes glazing over. Hypothermia was setting in. Elias stopped. He lifted the boy up and placed him behind the saddle, tying a length of rope around the child's waist and securing it to the girl, then to the saddle horn. "Hold him," Elias shouted to the girl over the wind. "Do not let him sleep. I hold," she said. Her voice was thin, but her grip on her brother's coat was iron. They reached the cabin just as the light began to fail. It was a low, squat structure built of rough-hewn pine logs, tucked into a cleft of rock that protected it from the worst of the avalanches. To Elias, it was just a shelter. To the children, it must have looked like a castle. Elias kicked the snow away from the door and shoved it open. The air inside was stale and cold, but it was still air. He hauled the children down from the horse, hurried them inside, and then led the roan into the lean-to stable attached to the side of the cabin. He tossed the horse an extra flake of hay, stripped the saddle, and ran back into the cabin. Fire first. He knelt before the stone hearth, his big hands shaking slightly as he shaved pitch wood from a stick. A spark from his flint and steel caught the tinder. He blew on it gently, coaxing the orange glow until it burst into flame. He fed it kindling, then split logs. The twins were huddled in the corner, far away from him, watching with wide, dark eyes. "Come to the fire," Elias commanded. They crept forward. Elias moved with the efficiency of a man who had lived alone for decades. He filled an iron pot with snow and set it on the hook. He sliced chunks of dried venison and dropped them in. He found a tin of precious sugar and added a pinch to the water. "Take your boots off," he said. The twins struggled with the frozen laces. Elias sighed, pushed their hands away, and did it himself. He worked the stiff leather off their feet. He inspected their toes in the firelight. They were white and waxy, but not black, not yet. "You are lucky," Elias grunted. He rubbed their feet with snow first, slowly, to bring the blood back without burning them. The pain of the thawing blood returning was agonizing. The boy hissed through his teeth, and tears leaked from the girl's eyes, but they made no sound. "I ain't no nursemaid," Elias muttered to the room, or perhaps to God. "I trap beaver. I don't raise shoats." He fed them the broth first, spooning it into their mouths when their hands shook too much to hold the cup. Then the meat. The warmth of the food seemed to drug them. Within an hour, they were asleep on his pile of bearskins, tangled together like puppies. Elias sat in his rocking chair, his pipe unlit in his hand, watching them. The wind howled outside, battering the door, sealing them in. For the next 3 days, the storm raged. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the white wall of snow against the window parchment and the crackle of the fire inside. It was a strange, claustrophobic intimacy. Elias was used to the silence being his own. Now, The silence was filled with breathing, with the rustle of small bodies, with the weight of eyes watching him. The twins watched everything he did. They watched him scrape the fat from a marten pelt, his knife moving in long, sure strokes. They watched him mend the trigger mechanism of a trap with a file. They watched him grease his boots. They made themselves small. They tried to help, sweeping the dirt floor with a twig broom, stacking the wood he brought in from the pile. Slowly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. "You are giant," the boy said on the second day. He was sitting cross-legged by the fire, whittling on a piece of firewood. "I am just a man who ate his porridge," Elias said without looking up from his work. "You are big like bear," the girl added. Elias grunted. "What do they call you? I can't keep calling you boy and girl." "I am called Two Elk," the boy said. "And I am called Little Bird," the girl said. Elias nodded. Two Elk, Little Bird. Good names. "I am Elias." "Elias." The girl tested the word. "It means giant bear. It means nothing. It's just a name my mother gave me before she died." The mention of mothers cast a shadow over the children. They went quiet. That night, the nightmares came. Elias was awake, staring at the embers. When the boy started thrashing in the furs, he cried out in his own language, shielding his face with his arms. "Run, Luta! Run!" he screamed. Elias froze. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to comfort a child. He reached out and awkwardly patted the boy's shoulder with his heavy hand. "Wake up, son. You are safe. You are in the cabin." The boy woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. He looked around wildly, then slumped against his sister, who had also woken up. She pulled him close, stroking his hair, murmuring soft words that sounded like a song. Elias watched them, his heart aching in a way he hadn't felt in years. He realized then that these two were not just survivors. They were a single organism, and the missing piece of them was this sister, Luda. In the firelight, with the wind dying down outside, they told him more. "She has hair like the raven wing," Little Bird said, touching her own short-chopped hair. "She sings the morning song better than anyone. When the blue coats came, the chief said to run, but Luda stood. She stood in front of the lodge. She had a knife. She cut the soldier," Two Elk said, a fierce pride in his voice. "He grabbed her hair. He hit her face, but she did not cry." Elias listened, staring into the flames. He could see it. He had seen it a dozen times in his life. The chaos of a raid, the smoke, the cruelty of men who were tired and scared and angry, taking it out on the weak. "She yelled at us to go," Little Bird whispered. "She looked at us. Her eyes said go. So we went." "Is she dead?" "Elias." Elias tapped his pipe on his knee. "I don't know. Child, the soldiers, they usually take prisoners if they can. Women, they take women." "To the fort?" Two Elk asked. "Maybe." The silence that followed was heavy. The children looked at him, their eyes huge and expectant. They were waiting for him to fix it, because he was a giant, because he had saved them from the snow. They believed he could save them from the world. Elias stood up and walked to the wall where he pinned his maps. It was a hand-drawn chart of the territory, marked with charcoal lines for ridges and rivers. He traced the line of the mountains down to the foothills. The fort was there, a square of ink on the parchment. Fort Laramie, or maybe a forward outpost. It didn't matter. It was all the same machine. He knew the officers who ran these places, men like Captain Fetterman or Colonel Chivington, hard men. Some were cruel for the sport of it. Others were just bureaucrats who viewed native people as an inventory problem to be solved with gunpowder or starvation. If he went down there, he was walking into a snake pit, a solitary trapper bringing in 2 native kids. They would ask questions. They would assume he was a squaw man, a traitor to his race. They might arrest him. They would certainly take the children. They would send them east to the mission schools, cut their hair, change their names, scrub the Indian out of them until they were hollow shells. And Luda? If she was alive. She was a prisoner, a spoil of war. Elias looked at his hands. They were big enough to crush a man's skull, but they felt helpless against the weight of what was being asked of him. He looked back at the twins. They had fallen asleep again, huddled together. He thought of the Mexican plaza. The boy from Tennessee, Trade. He looked around his cabin. His furs were stacked in the corner. Beaver, marten, fox. A season's worth of hard, freezing labor, worth maybe $400 in trade goods. A fortune to some. He had 2 horses. He had his rifle. He had his freedom. Elias felt an anger rise in him. Anger at the soldiers. Anger at the parents of these children for dying. Anger at the world for being so damn hard. But mostly, anger at himself, because he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had already made the choice. He could not be the man who walked away again. He walked over to the table and picked up his skinning knife. He tested the edge against his thumb. "Tomorrow," he said to the sleeping children, his voice barely a whisper. "Tomorrow we go down." He looked at the map one last time. He wasn't going to turn them in. He was going to trade. He would buy their lives, and the life of their sister, if he had to give up every pelt and every horse he owned, and if the soldiers wouldn't trade. Elias sheathed the knife with a sharp click. Then he would have to find another way, but he wouldn't leave them. Not this time. The wind outside dropped to a low moan, as if the mountain itself was sighing in resignation. Elias blew out the lantern. The darkness was absolute, but for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't alone in it. The morning they left the cabin, the sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low over the peaks. Elias moved through the small room with the economy of a man who knew he might never return. He did not look back at the walls he had notched with his own axe or the hearth where he had sat out a dozen winters. He looked only at the gear spread on the table. He packed with a grim precision. Into the leather saddlebags went the strips of dried venison, the small sack of coffee beans he had been hoarding, and his spare woolen socks. He took his best pelts, the dark, heavy beaver plues, the marten skins with fur-like smoke, and a single silver fox hide that shimmered in the gray light. He rolled them into a tight bundle, tying them with rawhide thongs. This was his bank account, his savings, his life's work for the season. It was worth perhaps $300 at the trading post, enough to buy whiskey and flour for a year, or a good horse, or a few nights of comfort in a town with soft beds. Now, it was just ballast for a trade he had not yet made. He turned to the twins. They sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, watching him. Their eyes were dark holes in their thin faces. Elias had cut down 2 of his old flannel shirts to fit them, belting the fabric around their waists with rope. They looked like small, ragtag scarecrows, swallowed by the wool. "Time to go," Elias rumbled. He wrapped them in the extra blankets, winding the heavy wool around their shoulders and over their heads until only their noses poked out. He led them out into the biting wind. The roan gelding stood in the snow, head down, enduring the cold with a stoic patience. Elias lifted Little Bird first, placing her in front of the high pommel of the saddle. He swung 2 elk up behind the cantle. "Hold on to each other," Elias commanded. "If you fall, the snow swallows you. You understand?" "Yes." "Elias," they said in unison, their voices muffled by the wool. Elias checked the cinch, patted the horse's neck, and took the lead rope in his gloved hand. He did not mount. The snow was too deep, the trail too treacherous. He would walk. He slung his heavy Hawken rifle across his back, the cold iron biting into his shoulder through his coat. They started down. The descent from the high country was a slow, grinding battle against gravity and ice. The trail was little more than a goat path cut into the side of a limestone cliff. To their left, the rock wall rose sheer and gray, weeping frozen tears of ice. To their right, the world dropped away into a canyon so deep the pine trees at the bottom looked like moss. The wind here did not scream. It shoved. It slammed against them in unpredictable gusts, threatening to knock the horse off its footing. Elias walked with his head bent, reading the snow. He tested every step, feeling for the treacherous slick of ice beneath the powder. Twice, the roan slipped, iron shoes striking sparks against hidden rock, and the twins gasped, clutching at the saddle leather. Elias merely tightened his grip on the lead rope, his boots digging in. anchoring 1,200 pounds of horse and children with his own weight until the animal found its balance. They dropped below the timberline as the day wore on. The world changed from white and gray to the dull, aching yellow of winter grassland. The scrub oak clawed at their legs, and the wind, no longer blocked by the peaks, swept across the vast, rolling hills with a relentless force. It was a bleak, empty country. There was no movement but the shifting of the grass and the slow drift of clouds. "We are alone," Two Elk whispered from the back of the horse. Elias heard him but said nothing. They were not alone. The land was full of ghosts. By late afternoon, they passed the remains of a camp in a shallow draw. It was old, maybe from the autumn. The lodge poles had been knocked down and scattered like pickup sticks. A wagon, likely stolen or traded for, sat burned to its axles, the iron rims of the wheels peeling away from the charred wood like apple skin. Elias led the horse past a mound of earth near the creek bed. It was a grave, marked by two sticks lashed together with rawhide to form a cross. The wood was gray and weathered. A coyote had dug at the corner of the mound, exposing a patch of faded calico cloth before giving up. The twins went very still. Elias felt their eyes on the grave. He saw Little Bird turn her face into the horse's mane. They did not ask who was buried there. They knew, in this country, death was not a visitor who knocked politely. It was the landlord. "Don't look," Elias said, his voice rough. "Keep your eyes on the horizon. That is where we are going. We see many graves," Two Elk said softly. "The soldiers make them." Elias kept walking. The fury in his chest was a cold, hard knot. He had spent his life trying to stay out of the wars between the army and the tribes. He was a trapper, a man of the mountains. He took beaver, not sides, but looking at the small, shivering shapes on his horse and the open sore of a grave in the frozen earth. He felt the neutrality stripping away from him like bark from a dead tree. They camped that night in a thicket of willows near a frozen stream. Elias made a small fire, keeping it low to avoid attracting attention. They ate dried meat and hardtack biscuits softened in snowmelt. The twins slept pressed against him for warmth, their breathing shallow and quick. Elias stayed awake, watching the stars wheel overhead, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. The next day, near the foothills, the isolation broke. Elias saw the dust first, a thin ribbon rising against the pale sky. Then came the squeal of an ungreased axle. A wagon was coming up the trail, heading north toward the mining camps. Elias pulled the roan off the trail, giving the wagon room to pass. He stood by the horse's head, his figure imposing in the buffalo coat. The wagon was pulled by two gaunt oxen. On the bench sat a man with a beard the color of straw and eyes that were red-rimmed and fearful. Beside him was a woman in a bonnet, clutching a baby wrapped in a shawl. In the back of the wagon, two older boys peered out over a jumble of furniture and barrels, clutching shotguns. The driver hauled on the reins, bringing the oxen to a halt. He looked at Elias, taking in the size of him, the rifle, the wildness of his dress. Then his eyes drifted to the horse. He saw the twins. The change in the man's face was instant. The fear curdled into something sharp and ugly. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow near Elias's boot. "You lost, mister?" the settler asked. "Not lost," Elias said. "Just traveling." The woman on the bench leaned forward, her eyes darting to the twins. "They are Indians," she hissed. "Look at them. Jeb, they are savages." The man shifted the reins to one hand and rested his other hand near the pistol stuck in his belt. "You carrying vermin now?" he asked Elias. "We heard there was trouble down south, burnings, raids, and here you are, hauling the enemy right up into the territory." "They are children," Elias said. His voice was low, rolling like distant thunder. "Just children. They grow up," the man said. He looked at Two Elk, who was staring back with wide, terrified eyes. A wolf pup grows into a wolf. They ought to be locked up, or shot, not wandering around decent folk. The boy in the back of the wagon raised his shotgun, leveling it vaguely in their direction. "Pa, should I run them off?" Elias moved. It was a small movement, just a shifting of his weight, but it brought the muzzle of his Hawken slightly forward. He did not point it, but the threat was unmistakable. He stood 6'4", a wall of fur and muscle and violence that had survived winters that killed lesser men. "You keep moving," Elias said. The settler looked at Elias's eyes. They were hard and flat, devoid of any fear. The settler swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He slapped the reins against the oxen's rumps. "Giddy up!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The wagon lurched forward. The wheels groaned. As they passed, the woman stared at the twins with a hatred so pure it chilled Elias more than the wind. She clutched her baby tighter, as if the mere sight of the native children would infect her child. "Scum," she whispered. Elias stood in the trail and watched them go until they were just a speck in the distance. He felt Little Bird trembling against the saddle horn. He reached up and placed his big hand over her small one. "Pay them no mind," he said. "They are scared. Scared folks are stupid folks. They hate us," Two Elk said. His voice was dull, accepting. Elias did not lie to them. "Yes, they do." He turned the horse back onto the trail. The encounter sat heavy in his gut. He had protected them from the settler, but he could not protect them from the world. The world was a wagon heading north, full of people who saw monsters where there were only children. They reached the fort 2 days later. It sat on a flat plateau above the river, a scar on the landscape. The fort was a rectangle of timber stockades, jagged and gray against the prairie. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, smearing the sky with soot. A flag snapped in the wind, the colors bright and alien against the muted earth tones of the plains. To Elias, it looked like a prison. To the twins, it must have looked like the mouth of hell. As they rode closer, the sounds of the fort drifted out to meet them, the sharp ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the braying of mules, the shout of orders, the melancholic notes of a bugle. Soldiers walked the parapets of the log walls. They wore blue coats that looked black in the distance. When they spotted Elias, a shout went up. "Rider, coming in!" Elias did not stop. He walked straight toward the main gate. The sentries raised their rifles, then lowered them as they recognized the giant figure. "It's the trapper," one soldier called down. "Elias, and looks like he's got a catch." Laughter rippled along the wall. Elias kept his eyes forward. He led the horse through the heavy timber gates and into the parade ground. The interior of the fort was an assault on the senses. It smelled of unwashed men, manure, wood smoke, and boiling cabbage. It was crowded with activity. Companies of cavalry were drilling on the far side of the yard, their sabers flashing in the dull light. Wagons were being unloaded. Dogs barked and snapped at the horses' heels. The twins shrank against the saddle, trying to make themselves invisible. Every face that turned toward them was white. Every pair of eyes was cold. There was curiosity. Yes, but it was the curiosity of a man looking at a trapped badger. "Get down," Elias said, halting the horse near the hitching rail of the central building. He lifted the twins down. Their legs were stiff from the ride. They clung to the sides of his coat, burying their faces in the fur. Elias could feel their hearts hammering against his legs. "Stay close," he said. He marched them across the muddy yard toward the headquarters. A group of soldiers smoking pipes near the barracks watched them pass. "Hey, Goliath!" one of them shouted. "You robbing the cradle now? Or did you run out of beaver to skin?" Elias ignored them. He pushed open the door to the commander's office and stepped inside, dragging the twins with him. The sudden warmth of the room was stifling. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner. Behind a heavy oak desk sat Major Vance. Vance was a man of 50, with a face that looked like it had been carved from dried leather. He had gray sideburns and eyes that were tired, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. He was writing in a ledger. He did not look up immediately. Elias waited. The twins pressed themselves into the corner behind him, peeking out like frightened mice. Finally, Vance set down his pen. He looked up, his gaze traveling from Elias's battered hat down to the trembling children. "Elias," the major said. His voice was dry, like paper rustling. "I heard you were up in the high basins." "I was," Elias said. "And yet, here you are." "With guests." Elias stepped forward. "I found them 3 days north. half froze. Their camp was hit. Vance nodded slowly. We had a patrol up that way last week. Captain Miller's company. Cleaning out some nests of hostiles near the foothills. Standard operations. Nests, Elias repeated, the word tasting like bile. They're kids. Major, they are seeds, Vance said. You leave the seeds, the weeds grow back, but I assume you didn't come here to discuss botany. What do you want? They say their sister was taken. Elias said, name of Luda. I want to know if she is here. Vance leaned back in his chair, steeping his fingers. We took a few prisoners, mostly women. We hold them to ensure the good behavior of the bucks who ran off. It's a standard tactic. Is she here? Elias asked, his voice hardening. Vance sighed. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray yard. Sergeant, he barked. The door opened. A soldier snapped to attention. Check the stockade. See if we have a wench named Luda. Bring her out to the yard. The sergeant saluted and left. Vance turned back to Elias. If she is here, it changes nothing. They are wards of the government now. The children will be sent east. There are schools in Pennsylvania. They will learn to read, write, and pray to a Christian God. They will forget the blanket and the savage tongue. And the woman? Elias asked. She stays here, as leverage, until the band surrenders or starves. The twins, hearing the tone, if not all the words, began to whimper. Trade, Two Elk whispered, tugging on Elias's coat. Trade now. Let's go outside, Vance said, putting on his hat. They walked out into the cold air. The yard had gone quiet. Word had spread that the giant trapper was meeting with the major. Soldiers had gathered, leaning on rifles, watching. A moment later, the door to the stockade, a low, windowless building, opened. Two guards dragged a woman out. She was small, wearing a torn buckskin dress. Her wrists were bound with heavy iron chains that clanked as she walked. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, her lip split, but she walked with her head high, her black hair streaming in the wind. It was Luda. When she saw the twins, she stopped dead. The guard shoved her, but she planted her feet. A sound tore out of her throat, half sob, half cry. The twins broke from Elias's grip. They ran to her, crashing into her legs. They could not hug her properly because of the chains, so they wrapped their arms around her waist, burying their faces in her dress. Luda dropped to her knees in the mud. She pressed her face against their hair, rocking them back and forth. She spoke to them in their language, fast and desperate, checking their faces, their hands. She looked up at Elias. Her eyes were black fire. There was gratitude there. Yes, but beneath it burned a fierce, terrifying anger. She looked at the soldiers surrounding them, then back at Elias, her expression asking the question, "You brought them to this place?" Vance stood beside Elias, watching the scene with a detached boredom. Touching. He said, "Now, Sergeant, separate them. Get the children to the supply wagon. They leave for the railhead tomorrow." "No!" Elias shouted. The sound was so loud it startled the horses at the rail. The soldiers stepped back, hands going to their belts. Vance looked at Elias, eyebrows raised. "Careful. Trapper, you are bordering on interference with military duties. I want to trade," Elias said. He reached into his coat and pulled out the pouch of coins. He threw it on the ground at Vance's feet. It landed with a heavy clink. $40 silver, and I got $300 in prime beaver and fox on my saddle. Take it. Take the horse, too. Vance looked at the money in the mud. He didn't bend to pick it up. "You think I sell prisoners for beaver skins?" Vance asked, a sneer curling his lip. "This is the United States Army. Elias, not a fur trading post. These people are not goods. They are enemy combatants and wards of the state." The twins were clinging to Luda, screaming as the guards tried to pull them away. Luda was fighting, kicking at the guards, shielding the children with her chained arms. "Trade!" Little Bird screamed, looking at Elias. "You said trade!" The sound of her voice, so full of betrayal, cut Elias deeper than any knife. He looked at the chaos. He looked at Vance's smug, tired face. He realized then that money meant nothing here. The fort didn't need furs. It needed blood. It needed the one thing Elias had that they didn't. "Stop!" Elias roared. He stepped between the guards and the woman. He shoved one guard back with a sweep of his arm that sent the man sprawling into the mud. The other guards raised their rifles, hammers clicking back. "Hold fire!" Vance shouted. Elias stood over the kneeling family. He breathed heavily, his breath pluming in the cold air. He looked at Vance. "You don't want my money," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you want?" Vance studied him. He looked at the width of Elias's shoulders, the way he moved, the way he knew the mountains better than any mapmaker in Washington. "I have 3 columns moving out next week," Vance said quietly. "We are pushing into the Bighorns. It is rough country. My scouts are drunkards or liars. I lose men every time we cross a ridge because we don't know what's on the other side." Elias went still. He knew what was coming. "I need a scout who knows the high passes," Vance said. "I need a man who can track a ghost over granite. I need you, Elias." Elias looked at Luta. She was watching him, her breathing ragged. She understood enough English to know what was being said. She shook her head slightly. "No." "I scout for you," Elias said, the words tasting like ash. "And you let them go?" "Not go," Vance corrected. "Custody. I will sign a paper granting you legal guardianship of the woman and the children. They will be your responsibility. They stay with the column. If you run, they hang. If you lead us into an ambush, they hang. But they stay together. And they stay out of the schools." Elias looked at the mountains in the distance. To scout for the army meant leading these soldiers to the camps of Luta's people. It meant using his knowledge of the wild to destroy it. It was a betrayal of everything he had lived for in the last 20 years. But then he looked at Two Elk's terrified face. He looked at the chains on Luta's wrists. He remembered the boy from Tennessee. He remembered the choice. One lives, one dies. This time, he would be the one to die. Not his body, but his soul. He would trade his honor for their lives. "Done," Elias said. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Vance smiled, a thin, wintry smile. "I thought you might see reason." The major turned to the guards. "Strike the chains." The guard hesitated, then unlocked the manacles from Luta's wrists. The iron fell into the mud with a dull thud. Luta rubbed her wrists, staring at Elias. Her eyes were wide. She knew what he had just done. She knew the cost. She looked from him to the soldiers who were now lowering their rifles, smirking, whispering to each other. "Look at that," one soldier muttered loud enough to be heard. "The giant bought himself a family, traded his freedom for a wildcat squaw." Another laughed. "Hope she's worth it." Luta stood up. She pulled the twins against her hips. She did not thank Elias. She looked at him with a mixture of horror and respect. She saw the trap he had walked into, and she saw that he had walked into it for her. Vance pulled a folded paper from his tunic and a pencil. He scribbled on it, using the guard's back as a desk, and signed it with a flourish. "Here," Vance said, handing the paper to Elias. "They are yours. We ride in 3 days. Don't be late for muster." Elias took the paper. He didn't read it. He shoved it into his pocket. He felt dirty. He felt small. He turned to Luta. "Get the children," he said softly. "We find a place to sleep." She nodded, silent. She took the twins' hands. They walked across the yard, the giant trapper leading, the native woman and children following. The soldiers parted to let them through, their laughter following them like a pack of hyenas. The trade was done. Elias had saved them, and in doing so, he had sold himself to the very thing he hated most. He looked up at the flags snapping in the wind, and for the first time in his life, he wished he were blind. The column moved like a dark iron snake winding through the chest-high sagebrush. 3 troops of cavalry, 60 men in total, rode in a double file that stretched back 1/4 of a mile. The sound of their passage was a constant, grinding rhythm. The clink of sabers against saddles, the creak of leather, the heavy, muffled thud of hooves on the half-frozen earth, and the low murmur of men who were bored, cold, and looking for a fight. At the head of this iron snake rode Elias. He sat on his big roan gelding, his buffalo coat making him look more like a bear than a man. He rode with his hawken rifle across his thighs, his eyes scanning the horizon not for game, but for the flash of a mirror or the rise of smoke that would signal he had led these men to their prey. 50 yards behind him, separated by the lead officers but ahead of the main dust of the column, rode Luta and the twins. They were mounted on 2 sturdy ponies Elias had requisitioned from the fort's quartermaster, part of the price of his soul. Luta rode with Little Bird in front of her, while 2 elk clung to the back of a pack mule that was tied to Luta's saddle. For the first 4 days out of the fort, Luta did not speak to Elias. She did not even look at him. When he dropped back to check on the twins, offering water or a strip of dried meat, she would stare fixedly at the ears of her horse. Her silence was louder than the wind. It was a wall of ice. She accepted the food for the children, but she took it without touching his hand, her face a mask of stone. Elias understood the silence. He felt it in his own gut. She was alive, and the children were safe from the mission schools, but the cost had been her dignity. She felt bought. She had been traded from the chains of the major to the custody of the trapper, and to a woman of the high plains, whose people valued freedom above breath itself. It was a humiliation that burned worse than a brand. The land began to change. They left the rolling yellow grasslands behind and pushed into the broken country. This was the Badlands, where the earth looked as if it had been tortured. Great spires of red and gray rock thrust up from the ground, twisted into shapes that resembled goblin castles and skeletal fingers. The wind here was treacherous, funneling through the canyons with a banshee scream that set the horses on edge. It was a place where things went to hide. At night, the army camped in tight defensive circles. Great fires were built from the twisted juniper wood that grew in the draws. The soldiers, glad to be out of the saddle, drank coffee black as tar and grew loud. Elias kept his distance. He built a small, separate fire on the periphery of the camp, upwind of the latrines and downwind of the horses. He sat on his saddle, whittling a stick, while Luta cooked a meager stew of beans and salt pork for the twins. From the main fires, the voices of the soldiers drifted over, carried by the thin air. "I tell you," one corporal's voice boomed, "there ain't no reasoning with them. You gotta break them like you break a Mustang. A sharp bit and a heavy hand." Another man laughed, a harsh, cracking sound. "Breaking? Hell. Smith, you give them too much credit. You don't break a wolf, you skin it. My daddy was in the Minnesota wars. He said the only good way to tame this country is to empty it out." Luta stiffened. She was stirring the pot, but her hand stopped. Her knuckles were white around the wooden spoon. The twins, sitting cross-legged on a buffalo robe, looked from their sister to the dark shapes of the soldiers against the firelight. They did not understand all the words, but they understood the tone. It was the sound of men who did not see them as people. Elias stopped whittling. He looked at Luta's rigid back. He looked at the twins, whose eyes were wide and reflecting the flames. The shame that had been gnawing at him since the fort rose up in his throat, choking him. He cleared his throat. It sounded like rocks tumbling in a dry wash. "They talk to hear themselves," Elias said, his voice low. "It is the talk of scared men." Luta turned slowly. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her face, illuminating the bruise that was still fading on her cheekbone. Her eyes were dark pools of judgment. "They talk of killing," she said. Her English was halting, heavy with the accent of her people, but clear. "They talk of my people like we are. Vermin. And you ride with them. You lead them. I ride to keep you out of the stockade," Elias said. "You ride because you made a trade," Luta snapped. "You bought us. Like a horse. Like a blanket. I did what kept you breathing." Elias shot back, his voice rising slightly before he checked it. He tossed the stick into the fire. It flared up, casting long shadows against the canyon wall. "I ain't proud of it, woman," Elias said, his voice dropping to a rumble. "I ain't proud of nothing I have done this week, but I learned a long time ago that pride don't keep the wind out." Luta watched him. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way his big hands hung empty between his knees. For the first time, she saw that the giant was not just tired. He was haunted. "Why?" she asked. Why did you trade for us? You could have ridden away. You have the mountains. You have no master." Elias looked into the fire. He was quiet for a long time. The wind hissed through the sagebrush. 20 years ago, Elias said, speaking to the flames, I was in a different war, south of here, Mexico. It was hot enough to boil your blood. The twins crept closer, listening. We were cut off, a patrol of 10 men, surrounded by lancers. We ran out of water. We ran out of powder. The captain, he was a coward. He told the Mexican colonel he would surrender the patrol if he was let go. Elias paused, his jaw working under his beard. They lined us up. The colonel walked down the line. He stopped at me. He liked my size. He said he needed a man to carry loads for his supply train. He said I could live if I walked away and left the others. Luta did not move. There was a boy, Elias continued, his voice cracking. Private Miller. From Tennessee. He was 17. He had a fever. He looked at me. Luta. He grabbed my hand. He begged me not to leave him. He said, Elias, don't let them take me. Elias closed his eyes. I pulled my hand away. I walked to the supply train. I carried their boxes. And I heard the shots behind me. I heard Miller scream. He opened his eyes and looked at her. They were wet, shining in the firelight. I have heard that scream every night for 20 years. I ran to the mountains to get away from it. But the mountains are quiet, and the scream is loud. He gestured vaguely toward the twins. When they grabbed my legs, when they begged me to trade, it was Miller again. I couldn't do it. I couldn't walk away twice. So I made the deal with the major. I sold my freedom to buy yours. Because if I didn't, I don't think I could have lived another day in this skin. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was different now. It was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. Luta looked at him. She looked at the scars on his hands, the gray in his beard. She saw a man who was broken in places that did not show. She moved around the fire. She sat down opposite him, drawing her knees up. My father was a chief, she said softly. He was strong. He could shoot a running antelope at 300 paces. Then the coughing sickness came, the white sickness. He coughed until blood came. He was skin and bone when he died. She picked up a twig and drew a line in the dirt. My mother. She believed the paper. The treaty paper. The soldiers said, move to the agency, and we will give you beef and blankets. She moved. We went to the agency. The beef was rotten. The blankets had bugs that made us sick. She died in the snow, waiting for the agent to open the storehouse. She looked up at Elias. I do not forgive the soldiers, and I do not forgive you for riding with them, but I see you carry a heavy pack. Giant man, maybe heavier than mine. She reached out and broke a piece of cornbread she'd been warming on a rock. She handed it to him. Eat, she said. The dead do not need us to starve. Elias took the bread. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was rough, calloused from work, but warm. He nodded, unable to speak, and took a bite. It tasted like ash and salt, but it was the best thing he had eaten in years. The next day, the column pushed deeper into the rocky country. The weather turned, the sky lowered, gray and threatening, and a biting sleet began to fall, coating the rocks in a treacherous glaze of ice. By mid-morning, Elias spotted signs. Not a war party, but the drag marks of travois poles, the sleds used by families to move camp. They are close, the major shouted, riding up beside Elias. Good work, scout. Which way? Elias looked at the tracks. They were heading into a box canyon to the west. He knew that canyon. It was a dead end. They went east. Elias lied, pointing toward a ridge of open timber, toward the high pass. The major squinted at the ground. These tracks go west. Elias, they are a decoy, Elias said smoothly. Old tracks. They want you to follow them into the rocks so they can double back. The real trail is on the ridge. The major hesitated. He didn't trust Elias, but he didn't know the land. Very well, the major grunted. We go to the ridge. They rode for 2 hours in the wrong direction. But the country was full of desperate people, and you could not hide them all. Around noon, they stumbled upon a small group huddled under an overhang of rock. It was 2 old women and 3 children, skeletal and wrapped in rags. They had no fire. They were waiting to die. The soldiers pulled up, rifles ready. The old women looked up with dull, resigned eyes. "Refugees!" the major spat. "Useless mouths. Leave them." Luda pulled her pony to a halt. She slid from the saddle before the horse had stopped moving. She ran to the overhang, ignoring the soldiers' shouts. She fell to her knees beside the women, speaking rapidly in her tongue. She pulled dried meat from her pouch, rations Elias had given her, and pressed it into their hands. "Get that woman back in line," the major barked. "We are on a campaign, not a charity mission." Elias turned his roan, blocking the major's view of Luda. "She is feeding them." "Major," Elias said, "feeding them just keeps them breeding." A sergeant muttered from the ranks. "Let the cold finish them. Save the bullet." Elias looked at the sergeant. He didn't say a word. He just stared until the man looked away, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. Elias dismounted. He walked over to Luda. He took his own canteen and handed it to the old women. He gave them the rest of his jerky. The major rode up, his face purple. "You are defying orders." "Scout, I am lightening my load," Elias said calmly. "My horse is tired." He helped Luda back into the saddle. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no anger in her eyes. There was a nod, acknowledgement. They were partners in this small rebellion, but the rebellion could not last. 2 days later, the luck ran out. The column crested a rise, the wind whipping the horses' manes. Below them, in a bowl-shaped valley protected from the wind, lay a village. It was not a war camp. It was a winter shelter. There were perhaps 15 lodges, smoke curling peacefully from the vent holes. Children were sliding on a frozen pond. Women were scraping hides staked out in the snow. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He had tried to steer the column wide, but the valley was the only way through the pass. He had hoped the band would be gone. "Target sighted," the major shouted, drawing his saber. The sound of the steel rasping from the scabbard was like a match strike. "Major!" Elias shouted, grabbing the bridle of the major's horse. "Hold! That ain't a war party. That is families. Look at the smoke. Look at the kids. They are hostiles harboring fugitives," the major said, jerking his horse free. "Bugler! Sound the advance." "No," Elias roared. "Give me 5 minutes. I will ride down. I will talk to them. They will surrender. You don't have to bleed them." The major looked at Elias with cold calculation. "You have 2 minutes. Scout, if I see a weapon raised, we fire." Elias kicked his roan into a gallop. He tore down the slope, his coat flying behind him. He stood in the stirrups, waving his hat. "Run!" he screamed in English. "Run! Soldiers!" He switched to the few words of the dialect Luda had taught him. "Ho-po-po! Kuwa! Go! Go!" The camp erupted. Women grabbed children. Men scrambled for weapons, not to fight, but to cover the retreat. Elias rode into the center of the camp, his horse skidding on the snow. He waved his arms at a group of young men who were pulling rifles from their furs. "Don't shoot," Elias bellowed. "Put it down. They will kill you all." A young brave, no older than 16, panicked. He saw the giant man on the big horse, saw the line of blue coats on the ridge. His hands shook. He raised an old trade musket. "Don't!" Elias shouted. Reaching out, the gun went off. The ball went wide, whistling past Elias's ear. But the sound was enough. On the ridge, the major dropped his arm. "Fire at will!" The volley from 60 carbines tore through the valley. It sounded like canvas ripping. The air was instantly filled with lead. Elias saw the young brave jerk backward, his chest exploding in a red mist. He saw a woman running with a baby tumble into the snow as if she had been tripped. "Stop!" Elias screamed, but his voice was lost in the thunder of the charge. The cavalry swept down the slope, a wave of blue death. They rode through the lodges, firing pistols at anything that moved. They set torches to the buffalo hide covers. The smell of burning hair and black powder filled the bowl of the valley. Elias sat on his horse in the middle of the whirlwind. He did not fire his rifle. He used his horse to block shots, to shoulder soldiers' horses away from fleeing women. He was a rock in a river of blood. But he could not stop the river. It was over in 20 minutes. The survivors had scattered into the rocks. The dead lay dark against the white snow. The lodges were bonfires. The twins were screaming from the top of the hill where the pack train had stayed. But Luta was not there. Luta had ridden down. Elias found her near the edge of the frozen pond. She was on her knees in the crimson slush. She was holding the body of a man. He was older, thin, with gray streaks in his hair. He wore a tunic embroidered with porcupine quills. In his stiffening hand, he clutched a half-finished wooden horse, a toy he had likely been carving when the blue coats came. Luta was rocking back and forth, a sound coming from her that was not human. It was the sound of a soul tearing in half. Elias dismounted. He walked toward her, his boots heavy as lead. "Luta," he said. She snapped her head up. Her face was smeared with blood. Not hers, but her cousin's. Her eyes were wild. She scrambled to her feet. She did not run to him for comfort. She ran at him. She struck him in the chest with her fists. She hit him again and again, screaming in her language. She clawed at his heavy coat, trying to hurt him, trying to tear through the fur to the man beneath. "You!" she shrieked in English. "You bring them! You bring the death!" Elias stood there. He did not raise his hands to defend himself. He let her hit him. He felt every blow, not as pain, but as judgment. "He was my kin," Luta sobbed, her strength failing. "He made toys. He made toys for 2 elk." She collapsed against him, sliding down his coat to the snow. She grabbed the hem of his garment, weeping into the fur. Elias looked down at her. He looked at the burning lodges. He looked at the major, who was walking among the bodies, prodding them with his boot to ensure they were dead. The major looked up and caught Elias's eye. "Good work, Scout," the major called out cheerfully. "We flushed them out. A textbook engagement." Elias felt a coldness settle into his marrow that had nothing to do with winter. He had done this. He had led them here. He had tried to play both sides, to trade his honor for safety, and the currency of that trade was the blood on Luta's face. He knelt down and scooped Luta up. She was limp, exhausted by grief. He carried her away from the smoke, away from the soldiers who were already looting the camp for souvenirs. That night, the army camped a mile downriver, away from the smell of the burning bodies. The mood in the camp was victorious. Bottles of whiskey were passed around. Men bragged about their aim. Elias took Luta and the twins far out, to the very edge of the picket line. He built a fire in the shelter of a limestone overhang. Luta sat staring into the flames. She had washed the blood from her face, but the stain remained in her eyes. The twins slept on either side of her, clutching her dress, exhausted by terror. Elias sat on the other side of the fire. He cleaned his rifle, running the oil rag over the barrel again and again. Though it was already clean, the silence stretched for hours. The wind howled outside the circle of light. "I'm sorry," Elias said finally. The words felt small and useless, like throwing a pebble into a canyon. Luta did not look at him. "Sorry does not bring back Grey Heron," she said. "Sorry does not build the lodges back." "No," Elias said. "It don't." She looked up then. The firelight caught the tears standing in her eyes. "I cannot save them all," she whispered. "My people, they are scattering like leaves. The wind is too strong." She reached out and touched the heads of the sleeping twins. "But I must save these 2. I promised my mother. I promised the spirits." She looked at Elias. Her gaze was piercing, stripping him bare. "You said you carry a heavy pack. Elias, you said you could not walk away again." "I did. Then do not walk away now," she said fiercely. "You are the scout. You have the eyes. You have the ear of the soldier chief." She leaned forward. "Stop them. Elias, do not just watch. Do not just warn. Stop them." Elias stopped cleaning his rifle. He looked at his hands. They were big hands, killer's hands. But they could also build. They could also protect. He looked at the major's tent in the distance, glowing with lamplight. He thought of the paper in his pocket that gave him custody of these children. It was a contract. But a contract with the devil was no contract at all. He looked back at Luta. "If I stop them," Elias said slowly, "I am a dead man. They will hang me." "If you do not stop them," Luta said, "you are already dead. You died with the boy in Mexico." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. She was right. He had been a ghost for 20 years, haunting the high country. Elias snapped the ramrod back into its holder under the barrel. He set the rifle down. "All right," he said. His voice was rough, but steady. "All right?" Luta asked. "I stand with you," Elias said. "Not with the fort, not with the paper. With you." He looked at her, and for the first time, he let her see the full depth of the regret and the resolve in his eyes. "From tomorrow," he said, "we don't lead them to camps. We lead them to ghosts. We lead them in circles until their horses drop and their bellies are empty. And if they get close, I will turn them. Whatever it takes." Luta studied him. She saw that he meant it. She saw that the trade had changed. He was no longer trading for safety. He was trading for redemption. She nodded. It was a small movement, but it sealed a pact more binding than any treaty. "Then we are together," she said. "Against the blue coats." "Yes," Elias said. "Together." The wind blew snow into the fire, making it hiss. Outside the small circle of light, the darkness was vast and filled with enemies. But inside the circle, for the first time, there were no secrets. There was only a man, a woman, and 2 sleeping children, and a dangerous, silent promise that would likely kill them all. The change in the march began subtly, like the shifting of the wind before a storm. For 3 days, Elias rode at the head of the column, his eyes scanning a horizon that was a jagged tapestry of granite and ice. To the soldiers behind him, he looked like a man diligently hunting for their enemies. To Luta, who rode in the middle of the formation with the twins, he was a man walking a razor's edge. The major wanted blood. He wanted to flush out the bands that were rumored to be wintering in the deep pockets of the Absaroka Range. But every time the tracks grew fresh, or the wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke, Elias would halt the column. He would dismount, study the ground with a theatrical intensity, and then point a heavy, gloved finger in the wrong direction. "The tracks are old. Major." Elias would lie, his voice steady as rock. "They doubled back here. The snow has filled the prints, but the crust is broken to the east. We need to go east." And so they went east, away from the sheltered valleys where the families were hiding, and up onto the spine of the ridges where the wind stripped the heat from a man's bones in minutes. The land turned against them. The rolling foothills gave way to steep, treacherous draws choked with deadfall timber. The horses struggled in snow that was chest-deep in the drifts. Men cursed as their mounts slipped on hidden plates of shale, sliding 20 feet down icy embankments. Elias drove them hard. He led them through thickets of lodgepole pine so dense the troopers had to dismantle their saddles to squeeze through. He took them across creek crossings where the ice was too thin to hold weight, forcing the men to wade in freezing water that turned their boots into blocks of iron. He was wearing them down. He was using the mountains as a weapon, hoping that exhaustion would break the major's will before they found another camp to burn. Luta watched him. She rode with a blanket wrapped tight around herself and Little Bird, her eyes fixed on the giant figure ahead. She saw what he was doing. She saw him pause at a fork in the game trail, sniff the air, catch the scent of roasting meat from the north, and then deliberately turn his horse south, leading the soldiers into a box canyon filled with nothing but wind and wolf tracks. Her fear began to give way to a cautious hope. He was keeping his word. He was leading the wolf pack away from the lambs. But Major Vance was not a stupid man. By the 4th day of chasing phantoms, his patience had worn through. The column had halted on a windswept plateau. The horses were blowing hard, their flanks sunken. The men were sullen, huddled in their coats, beating their arms to keep the blood moving. Vance rode up to Elias, his face a mask of red-chapped skin and suspicion. "We have been riding for a week." "Elias," Vance snapped, "we have seen nothing but rock and ice. My men are freezing, the horses are lame, and yet I know they are out here. It is a big country." "Major," Elias said, not looking at him, "and they don't want to be found." Vance narrowed his eyes. "Or perhaps you do not want to find them." Elias turned in his saddle. The movement was slow, deliberate. If you think you can read the signs better, Major, the lead is yours." Vance stared at him, weighing the insubordination against his own ignorance of the terrain. He spat on the frozen ground. "We will camp here," Vance ordered. "Tomorrow. I'm sending out a forward scouting party. You, Sergeant Kincaid, and Corporal Dunn. You will ride 10 miles out. If you find nothing, we turn back to the fort. But if I find out you have been walking us in circles... Elias, the deal is off. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elias rumbled. The next morning, the sky was a sheet of iron gray. The air was heavy, static with the promise of snow. Elias saddled his roan. Sergeant Kincaid and Corporal Dunn were waiting for him. Kincaid was a hard man with a scar running through his eyebrow and a mouth that was always twisted in a sneer. Dunn was younger, eager to please, with eyes that held a dull cruelty. They rode out in silence, leaving the main column behind. They pushed west, toward a line of dark timber. As they rode, the soldiers talked. They did not include Elias in their conversation. To them, he was little better than the people they were hunting, a white man who had gone native in his soul. "I heard the colonel has a new plan for the spring," Kincaid said, shifting his chewing tobacco from one cheek to the other. "What is that?" Dunn asked. "We ain't just burning lodges no more. Washington wants a permanent solution. They are building a school in Pennsylvania. Carlisle. They call it, or something like that." "A school?" Dunn laughed. "For Indians?" Kincaid nodded. "The orders are to round up the children. Every pup we find under the age of 12, we ship them east, cut their hair, put them in suits, teach them English, beat the savage out of them until they are white on the inside. Kill the Indian. Save the man," Dunn recited, quoting a phrase he had heard in the barracks. "Exactly," Kincaid said. "It is smarter than bullets. You kill the warriors." "Sure, but if you take the kids, you kill the future. In one generation, there won't be no Sioux or Cheyenne, just dark-skinned plowboys who forgot their own names." Elias felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He stared straight ahead between the ears of his horse. He thought of Two Elk and Little Bird. He thought of them in stiff woolen suits, sitting in rows in a brick room, their names stripped away, their tongues forbidden to speak the words their mother had taught them. It was a violence more complete than any massacre. A massacre killed the body. This school was built to eat the soul. He realized then that the trade he had made with Vance was a lie. Even if he saved Luta and the twins now, even if he kept them safe for this campaign, the machine was coming for them. The fort, the railroad, the schools, it was all one great grinding wheel, and it would not stop until it had crushed everything wild into dust. "You find any tracks?" "Trapper," Kincaid called out, breaking Elias's reverie. Elias looked at the snow. He saw the faint, telltale depression of an unshod pony heading toward the creek. "Nothing," Elias lied. "Just deer. They rode for another hour." The wind began to pick up, stinging their faces. The clouds lowered until they touched the tops of the trees. "Looks like a blizzard coming," Kincaid grunted, looking at the sky. Elias looked at the dark wall of cloud rushing toward them from the north. It was a whiteout storm, a widow-maker. "We best head back," Elias said, "before we lose the trail." They turned their horses. As they rode back toward the column, Elias made his decision. He could not stay. He could not play this game any longer. If he stayed, he was handing the twins over to a future where they would cease to exist. When they reached the main encampment, the chaos of the approaching storm had already taken hold. Men were shouting, struggling to drive picket pins into the frozen earth. Tents were flapping wildly. The horses were nervous, their ears pinned back. Elias dismounted and handed his reins to a private. He scanned the camp. He saw Luta near the supply wagon. She was trying to shelter the twins under a buffalo robe. She looked up and met his eyes across the swirling snow. He walked to her. He did not stop to report to Vance. "The storm is hitting," Elias said, his voice low so the nearby guards would not hear. Luta looked at the sky. "It is a big one. The spirits are angry." Elias leaned in close. "We are leaving," he whispered. Luta's eyes widened. "Now? In this?" "It is the only way," Elias said. "The snow will cover our tracks. The wind will hide the sound. If we stay, Major Vance will take the children. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he will take them." Luda looked at the twins. She looked at the soldiers struggling with the canvas tents. She nodded. "I know a place," she whispered. "A canyon. 2 days' ride from here. But hard riding. It is hidden. My people used to winter there when the buffalo were scarce. It has water. It has shelter." "Good," Elias said. "Be ready. When the snow starts falling thick, go to the picket line. Take your ponies." "What about the guards?" Luda asked. "I will take care of the guards. And I need to get something first." Elias turned and walked toward the commander's tent. The wind was howling now, a shrieking gale that drowned out footfalls. He pushed through the flap of Vance's tent. The major was not there. He was outside shouting orders. The tent was empty, lit by a single swaying lantern. Elias moved to the field desk. He rifled through the papers, maps, supply lists, muster rolls. He found it. The document Vance had signed at the fort, transfer of custody. Luda and 2 miners to Elias Thorne. It was a flimsy shield, just a piece of paper. But in the world that was coming, paper was more powerful than lead. He folded it and shoved it into his tunic pocket. He slipped out of the tent. The snow was falling in earnest now, a curtain of white that reduced visibility to 10 feet. The camp was a confusion of shouting men and shadows. Elias moved to the picket line. The guard was huddled against a wagon wheel, his back to the wind, his hat pulled down over his eyes. Elias moved like a ghost. He stepped up behind the man. He did not kill him. He brought the heavy brass butt of his Hawken rifle down on the back of the man's head. The guard crumpled without a sound. Elias dragged him into the shadows under the wagon. He moved to the horses. Luda was already there, the twins clinging to her legs. "Quick!" Elias hissed. He slashed the picket ropes with his knife. He boosted Luda onto her pony. He lifted Little Bird up in front of her and 2 elk behind her. "Hold on to the mane," Elias told the boy. "Do not let go." He swung onto his own big roan. He took the lead rope of Luda's pony. "Ride close," Elias said. "If you lose sight of my horse's tail, you are dead." They turned their mounts away from the camp, away from the warmth of the fires, and rode straight into the teeth of the blizzard. The escape was a nightmare of white. The wind hit them like a physical blow, screaming in their ears, driving ice crystals into their eyes. There was no up or down, only the howling void. The cold was instantaneous and brutal. It found every gap in their clothing, every seam in their boots. Elias rode by instinct. He could not see the landmarks. He navigated by the slope of the ground and the direction of the wind. He kept his head down, trusting the roan to find footing on the invisible earth. Behind him, Luda rode with a fierce, desperate strength. Her arms were wrapped around Little Bird. Her body hunched forward to break the wind for the child. 2 Elk had his face buried in her back, his small hands gripping her belt so tight his fingers were numb. They rode for hours. Time lost its meaning. There was only the rhythmic crunch of hooves, the roar of the wind, and the creeping numbness that started in the toes and fingers and worked its way inward. Sometime after midnight, the ground began to drop away. Elias pulled up. He dismounted, vanishing into the snow for a moment before reappearing at Luda's stirrup. "We are here," he shouted over the wind. "The mouth of the canyon." He led the horses down a narrow, twisting trail. The walls of rock rose up on either side, cutting the wind. The roar diminished to a dull moan overhead. They stumbled into the basin. It was dark, but the air was still. They were sheltered. Elias halted the horses in a grove of twisted cedar trees. He pulled Luda and the children down. They fell into the snow, their legs too stiff to hold them. "Fire!" Elias croaked. His beard was a block of solid ice. He worked with clumsy, frozen fingers. He broke dead branches from the cedars. He struck his flint. It took 5 tries, 10 tries. Finally, a spark caught the dry moss. When the flame leaped up, they huddled around it, shaking violently. The heat was painful as it hit their frozen skin. Elias looked at the twins. Their faces were waxy, their eyes dull. He rubbed their hands, their feet, forcing the blood back. "We made it," he whispered, looking at Luda. She looked back at him across the fire. Her hair was frozen into icicles. She looked like a spirit of the winter. "We are free," she said. The days that followed were a blur of survival. They were isolated in a pocket of the world, a hidden canyon where the sun only touched the bottom for 4 hours a day. The snow piled up 10 feet deep at the entrance, sealing them in. They had no tent. They had limited food. They had only their hands and their will. Elias built a lean-to against the canyon wall, using fallen timber and the heavy buffalo robes. He chinked the gaps with snow and mud that he thawed by the fire. It was small, dark, and smoky, but it was warm. Hunger was their constant companion. The supplies from the saddlebags ran out in 3 days. Elias set snares in the brush. He caught snowshoe hares, white ghosts that tasted of pine needles. He cut a hole in the ice of the creek and fished with a line made of horsehair and a hook bent from a nail. He caught small, bony trout. Luda worked as hard as he did. She dug under the snow for roots. She stripped the inner bark of the aspen trees to boil into a bitter tea that stopped the hunger pangs. The twins, resilient as weeds, found ways to help. Two Elk gathered wood, dragging branches twice his size through the snow. Little Bird used snow to scour the cooking pot. They began to decorate the lean-to. They found red berries and strung them on thread. Two Elk carved figures out of cedar wood, a horse, a bear, a tiny soldier. They pushed sticks into the dirt walls of the shelter and hung their treasures, turning the hovel into a home. Slowly, the rhythm of their life changed. The fear of the soldiers faded, replaced by the immediate demands of staying alive. Elias and Luda moved around each other in the small space with a growing ease. They were partners. When he brought in a rabbit, she skinned it. When she mended his coat, he sharpened her knife. They spoke little during the day, but their silence was companionable, born of shared labor. It was in the evenings, when the dark pressed in against the hide door, that the change happened. The twins would fall asleep early, tangled together under the furs in the corner. Elias and Luda would sit by the small fire in the center of the lean-to. They began to talk, not about the weather or the food, but about the things that lived in the dark corners of their minds. Elias told her about his life before the mountains. He told her about a farm in Ohio he had left when he was 15. He told her about the woman he had courted once, a school teacher who had looked at his rough hands and turned away. He told her how the silence of the wilderness had become a drug to him, a way to keep from hearing his own loneliness. Luta listened, her dark eyes reflecting the embers. She told him of her husband, a warrior who had died in the first raids. She told him of the child she had lost 2 winters ago, a baby girl who had coughed until she went still. "I held her," Luda said, her voice hollow. "I held her for a day after she was gone. I could not let her go into the cold ground. My mother, she had to take her from my arms. I promised my mother I would be strong, but I was not strong. I was broken." She stared into the fire, her hands trembling in her lap. "I failed them. Elias, I failed to protect them, and now I have dragged these children into the snow to starve." Elias looked at her. He saw the crushing weight of her guilt, a mirror of his own. He reached out. It was a tentative movement, awkward for a man who had not offered comfort in decades. He put his large hand on her shoulder. "You ain't failed." "Luda," he said gently, "look at them." He nodded toward the sleeping twins. "They are warm. They are breathing. You fought the whole world for them. That ain't failure. That is the bravest thing I ever saw." Luta turned to look at him. A sob broke from her throat, a jagged, painful sound. She began to shake, her composure shattering. Elias moved then. He did not think. He simply reacted to her pain. He reached out and pulled her toward him. She resisted for a heartbeat, stiffening, but then she collapsed against his chest. She buried her face in his flannel shirt and wept. Elias wrapped his arms around her. He felt how small she was, how thin. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He smelled smoke and pine and the scent of a woman. He held her while she cried. He rocked her slightly, murmuring nonsense words, the same low rumble he used to calm a frightened horse. Slowly, the weeping stopped. Luta went still against him. She did not pull away. She stayed there, her forehead pressed against the hollow of his throat, her breathing syncing with his. The atmosphere in the lean-to shifted. The grief, hanging in the air, began to transmute into something else. The heat of their bodies, pressed together against the cold, sparked a sudden, fierce awareness. Luta lifted her head. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, swollen, but searching. She traced the line of his beard with her fingertips. She touched the scar on his cheek. "You are not a monster, Elias," she whispered. "You are a good man." Elias looked down at her. His heart was hammering in his chest like a trapped bird. He felt a rush of emotion so strong it made him dizzy, gratitude, fear, and a deep, aching desire to be known, to be held. "I am just a man," he rasped, "a tired man." She reached up and pulled his face down to hers. When they kissed, it was clumsy, their noses bumped, their beards and hair tangled. But then Luta opened her mouth, and the kiss deepened, becoming desperate. It was a hungry kiss, a kiss that tasted of tears and smoke. They clung to each other. It was not the smooth, practiced passion of a romance novel. It was the rough, frantic need of two people who had been alone for too long. It was an affirmation that they were alive, that their blood still ran hot despite the ice outside. Elias's hands, usually so careful, moved over her back, pulling her closer, as if he could merge their bodies into one shield against the world. Luta's hands gripped his shoulders, anchoring herself to him. They sank back onto the furs. The fire popped and hissed. That night, they did not just share warmth, they shared the burden of their existence. They touched scars, both old and new. They whispered names in the dark. The act of love was a rebellion, in a world that wanted them dead, or separated, or erased. They chose to be one. Later, as the fire burned down to red coals, they lay tangled together under the buffalo robes. The twins slept soundly a few feet away, oblivious. Elias lay on his back, staring at the roof of the lean-to. Luta's head was resting on his chest, her arm thrown across his stomach. He felt a profound tenderness wash over him, but it was mixed with a sharp, biting fear. He had something to lose now. Before, he had only his life. Now, he had this. He had her. He wondered if he was worthy of it. He was a man who had traded honor for survival once. Could he be the man she needed? Luta shifted, her hand tightening on his shirt. She was awake. She was thinking of her people, of the camp they had left, of the cousin she had buried. She wondered if lying with this white man, this former scout for the enemy, was a betrayal. But then she listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong beneath her ear. She felt the warmth of his skin. No, she thought, this is not betrayal. This is survival. This is a new tribe of two. Elias, she whispered into the dark. I am here, he said. Do not let go. Never. He promised. Outside. The wind howled through the canyon, hunting for them. But inside, under the snow and the hides, they held on to each other. And for this one night, it was enough. The peace in the canyon lasted for 3 weeks. It was a time out of time, a bubble of frozen silence where the only laws were the laws of survival and the slow, quiet knitting together of 4 broken people. But the world outside was not asleep. It was hunting. It ended on a Tuesday morning, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Elias had gone out at first light to check the snares near the canyon mouth. The snow had crusted over in the night, hard enough to walk on if you stepped carefully. He saw the sign before he reached the first cedar tree. It was a broken branch, snapped clean at waist height. No deer moved like that. No elk broke a limb that thick. Elias knelt, his heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm against his ribs. He brushed the snow away from the base of the tree. There, preserved in the ice shadow, was the print of a heel, a hobnailed boot heel, an army boot. Elias did not check the snares. He turned and ran back to the lean-to. his long legs eating the distance, his breath tearing in his throat. "They found us," he said as he burst through the hide door. Luta was grinding pine nuts on a flat stone. She stopped. She did not ask how. She looked at the twins, who were playing with the carved wooden soldiers two elk had made. "Pack," she said. It was too late. They heard the crunch of snow outside, not the stealthy approach of a scout, but the heavy, confident tramp of many men. A voice, amplified by the canyon walls, boomed out. "Elias Thorne, this is Major Vance. We know you are in there. Come out with your hands empty, or we fire the shelter." Elias grabbed his Hawken rifle. He moved to the door, his body blocking the opening. "Stay down," he hissed to Luta. "Keep the children on the floor." He pushed the hide flap aside with the barrel of his gun. Outside, the canyon was filled with blue coats. They were lined up on the ridge, rifles leveled. Vance stood in the center of the clearing, flanked by Sergeant Kincaid and a dozen troopers. They looked ragged, frostbitten, and furious. They had tracked a ghost for 3 weeks, and now they had cornered him. "Don't do it!" Elias, Vance shouted, "seeing the rifle. I have 20 carbines pointed at that hut. You fire one shot, and we turn it into a sieve. Think of the children." Elias looked at the line of rifles. He looked back into the dark hovel where Luta was crouched over the twins, shielding them with her body. He knew the ballistics. 50 caliber slugs would punch through the brush walls like they were paper. He lowered the rifle. He stepped out into the snow, raising his empty hands. "I am coming out," he rumbled. "Don't shoot." Soldiers rushed him. They hit him hard, the way men hit a bear that is finally trapped. A rifle butt slammed into his kidney, driving him to his knees. Another caught him on the jaw. They dragged his arms back and bound his wrists with rawhide, pulling it so tight it cut into the meat. "Bring the squaw," Kincaid shouted. 2 troopers dove into the lean-to. There was a scream, Luta fighting, and the high, terrified wail of the twins. They were dragged out into the light. Luta was kicking and spitting, her face twisted with rage. 2 Elk was biting the hand of the soldier holding him. Little Bird was sobbing, reaching for Elias. Elias surged forward, snapping the rawhide on one wrist, roaring with a primal fury. "Don't touch them," he bellowed. A trooper stepped up and swung his carbine like a club. The stock connected with Elias's temple. The world exploded into white light. Then darkness. He woke up being dragged. His head throbbed with a sickening rhythm. He was tied to a horse, stumbling through the snow. Luta and the twins were on ponies ahead of him, their hands bound. They marched out of the canyon. Behind them, smoke rose into the gray sky. The soldiers had torched the lean-to, the carved wooden soldiers, the string of red berries, the firs where they had made love. It was all ash now. The journey back to the settlement was a blur of pain and cold. They reached the town of Bitter Creek 2 days later. It was a raw, ugly scab of a town that had grown up in the shadow of the fort. A collection of saloons, a livery stable, a general store, and a jailhouse built of thick cottonwood logs. The arrival of the patrol was an event. People spilled out of the buildings to watch. Rumors had outpaced the horses. The giant trapper had turned traitor. He had killed a guard. He had run off with a hostile woman and her brood. Traitor! A woman shouted from a porch, throwing a bucket of slops into the street as Elias passed. "Hang him!" a miner yelled. Elias walked with his head up, though blood had dried in his beard. He looked at the faces of the townsfolk. He saw fear, boredom, and a hunger for violence. They threw Elias into the single cell in the back of the marshal's office. It was a stone box, damp and smelling of old urine. Luta and the twins were dragged to a shed behind the livery stable. Elias heard the heavy bar drop on the door. For 2 days, he sat in the dark. He did not sleep. He paced the 6 feet of his cell, his mind racing. On the 3rd morning, the heavy door opened. Major Vance stepped in. He looked clean, shaved, and utterly weary. "The hearing is set for noon," Vance said, not meeting Elias's eyes. "It will be quick." "A hearing?" Elias rasped. "You mean a show. You deserted your post. Elias, you assaulted a sentry. You stole government property, and you aided the enemy in a time of war. The penalty for any one of those is death. For all three. Vance shrugged. And the others? Elias asked. Luta, the children. They are accessories. And the children, the order for the school still stands. As soon as you are dealt with, they go east. The woman goes to the stockade. Elias moved so fast Vance flinched, hand going to his pistol. Elias gripped the iron bars of the cell door. No, Elias said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, terrifying growl. You listen to me. Vance, you want a hanging? Fine. You want to look like a hero to these people? Fine. But if you touch those kids, if you send them to that school to die of grief, I will speak at my hanging. Vance frowned. You will speak anyway. I will tell them everything, Elias said. I will tell them how you burned the winter camp. I will tell them how you shot women running with babies. I will tell them your great victory was a massacre of starving families. I will make sure every newspaper man in the territory knows that Major Vance is a butcher who is afraid of children. Vance's face hardened. No one will believe a traitor. Some will, Elias said. Enough to ruin your promotion, enough to stain your name. Vance stared at him. He was a career soldier. His reputation was the only currency he had. What do you want? Vance asked. A trade, Elias said. One last trade. I'm listening. I plead guilty. I walk up those steps without a fight. I let you hang me. In exchange, you sign a paper. A real one this time. Witnessed by the preacher and the town clerk. What does the paper say? It says Luta and the twins are under the protection of the town. It says they are free citizens. It says the army has no claim on them. No schools, no stockades. They live where they want. And you promise, on your honor as an officer, that you never touch a hair on their heads again. Vance considered it. It was a way out. A clean execution, a silenced witness, and he would be rid of the trapper forever. The woman and children were nothing to him, just loose ends. I can't grant citizenship, Vance said. That takes a judge. Then grant them permanent parole, Elias countered. Grant them immunity from the school order. Make them untouchable. Vance nodded slowly. I can do that. Bring the preacher, Elias said, and bring the paper. 2 hours later, the deal was struck. The document was drawn up by the nervous town clerk, a man with ink-stained fingers. It was full of legal jargon, indefinite parole, humanitarian exemption, wardship transferred to local clergy. It was a crooked shield, full of holes, but it was better than nothing. Vance signed it. The preacher, a somber man named Reverend Cole, signed it. Elias read it through the bars. It was enough. Done, Elias said. When Luta heard the news, she did not weep. She raged. She bribed the guard at the shed with a silver button from her dress to let her see Elias. She marched into the jailhouse, her small frame vibrating with fury. You fool, she hissed, slamming her hands against the bars. You stupid, giant fool. Luta, Elias said gently, you trade your life. For paper. She spat on the floor. I did not pull you from the snow to watch you swing. I did not lie with you in the canyon to be a widow. There is no other way, Elias said. If I fight, we all die. If I run, they hunt us down. This way. You live. The twins live. You can go back to the mountains. I do not want the mountains without you, she shouted. Her voice broke. I want you. Elias reached through the bars and took her hands. They were cold and rough. I am tired, Luta, he said softly. I am tired of the boy from Mexico screaming in my head. I am tired of running. This feels like the first clean thing I have done in 20 years. He squeezed her hands. You take them. Luta, you raise them strong. You tell them I wasn't just a trapper. Tell them I was their father, in the way that matters. Luta looked at him, tears spilling over her cheeks. She saw the peace in his eyes. It was a terrifying peace, the calm of a man who has accepted his end. I will not let you do this, she whispered. It is done, Elias said. The morning of the hanging was bright and cold. The sun glared off the snow-packed street. The town square was packed. Men stood on wagon beds to get a better view. Women held their shawls tight against the wind. Children sat on pickle barrels, their legs dangling, eyes wide with morbid curiosity. A rough gallows had been built in front of the livery stable. A fresh rope hung from the beam, the noose swaying gently in the breeze. The door of the jail opened. Elias stepped out. He was unbound, as per the agreement. He wore his buffalo coat, though it was torn and dirty. He walked tall, his head unbowed. Major Vance walked beside him, looking grim and important. They marched to the steps of the gallows. The crowd went silent. Elias climbed the steps. The wood creaked under his weight. He stood on the trapdoor and looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the hatred, the fear, the hunger. The Reverend Cole stepped forward, holding a Bible in the folded paper. "Dearly beloved," Cole began, his voice shaking. "We are gathered here to carry out the sentence of the law." "Stop!" The voice cut through the air like a whip crack. Luta pushed through the crowd. She was holding the twins by the hand. They were dressed in their ragged buckskins, but their faces were scrubbed clean. They looked small and fierce. She walked up the steps of the gallows. The crowd gasped. Vance stepped forward to block her. "Get her down!" Vance shouted to the guards. "No!" Luta screamed. She turned to the crowd. Her voice was high and clear, carrying to the back of the square. "You want to watch a man die?" she shouted. "Then you listen to why he dies." She pointed at Elias. "This man is not a traitor. He is a savior. He did not steal. He saved children from the fire." She pointed a shaking finger at Vance. "Ask him. Ask the soldier chief. Ask him about the winter camp. Ask him about the babies in the snow." Vance's face went purple. "Gag her," he roared. But the crowd was murmuring. They were Western people, hard people, but they had a code. You didn't kill women and children, not in cold blood, not if you were decent. Two Elk stepped forward. He was trembling, but he looked at the crowd. He spoke in English, his voice small but steady. "The soldiers burned my house," he said. "They shot my cousin. He was making a toy horse." Little Bird stepped up beside him. "Elias picked us up," she said. "He carried us in the storm. He gave us his food." She looked at the noose. "He is good," she whispered. "Do not hurt the giant." The silence in the square was heavy now. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of shame. A woman in the front row, a rancher's wife with a sunbonnet, began to cry. She put her hand to her mouth. "It ain't right," a man's voice called out from the back. A miner with a pickaxe over his shoulder. "Hanging a man for saving kids. That don't sit right." Vance looked around. He saw the mood shifting. He saw the guards hesitating. "Proceed with the execution!" Vance shouted. "He is a deserter!" Reverend Cole looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at Elias, standing calm under the rope. He looked at Luta and the twins. The Reverend was a timid man, but he feared God more than he feared the Major. He cleared his throat. "Major," he said, "the agreement. Read it." Elias said from the trapdoor. His voice rolled over the crowd. "Read the trade, Reverend." Cole unfolded the paper. His hands shook, rattling the parchment. "It says here," he read, his voice gaining strength, "that, in exchange for the life of Elias Thorne, the United States Army grants full protection and permanent parole to Luta and the children known as Two Elk and Little Bird." He looked up at the crowd. "It says he traded his life for theirs." A shockwave went through the crowd. The whisper started at the front and rippled back. Traded for their lives. He traded himself. The rancher's wife stepped forward. She walked right up to the gallows. She looked at Vance. "Is that true, Major?" she asked. "Did you make a deal to kill a man so you could wash your hands of these children?" "It is a legal agreement," Vance spluttered. "He is a criminal. He is a better man than you," the miner shouted. He stepped forward, pushing through the guards. Others followed. A shopkeeper, a blacksmith. They formed a loose ring around the gallows, not attacking, but blocking. "We don't hang men for saving kids in Bitter Creek," the blacksmith said, crossing his massive arms. "Not today." Vance looked at his soldiers. They looked uncomfortable. They were outnumbered, and they knew it. And more than that, they knew the town was right. Vance looked at Elias. Elias was smiling. It was a sad, tired smile. But it was triumphant. "You lose, Major," Elias said softly. Vance realized he had lost the crowd. If he ordered the execution now, there would be a riot. He would be the villain of the territory. He took a deep breath. He smoothed his tunic. He tried to salvage his dignity. "Very well," Vance said. His voice clipped. "If the town wishes to harbor a criminal, that is your affair. But he is stripped of rank. He is banished from the fort. If I see him on military land again, I will shoot him myself." He turned to the guards. "Cut him down. We are leaving." The guard sliced the rope. The noose fell to the damp wood. Elias stepped off the trap door. His legs felt weak, shaking with the adrenaline crash. Luta ran to him. She didn't care about the crowd. She threw her arms around his waist, burying her face in his coat. The twins grabbed his legs. Elias put his hand on Luta's head. He looked out at the crowd. The blacksmith nodded to him. The crying woman wiped her eyes and managed a small, tentative smile. "Thank you," Elias rumbled. "Get out of here," the blacksmith said. "Go find a valley where the army don't go." Elias nodded. He looked at Vance, who was mounting his horse, his back stiff with rage. "Come on," Elias said to his family. "Let's go home." They walked through the parting crowd. The giant trapper, the fierce woman, and the two children who had stopped a hanging with the truth. They walked out of the shadow of the gallows and into the blinding white light of the snow. The rope swung empty in the wind, a testament to the trade that had failed to kill a man, but had succeeded in saving a soul. The rope had been cut, but the shadow of the gallows still stretched long across the muddy street of Bitter Creek. The crowd dispersed slowly, like water draining from a tub, leaving behind a residue of awkward silence. Men who had been shouting for blood 5 minutes ago now scuffed their boots in the dirt, avoiding eye contact. Women pulled their shawls tight and hurried their children away, whispering in hushed tones about judgment and mercy. Elias stood at the bottom of the wooden steps. He felt lightheaded, the adrenaline of his near-death draining away to leave a bone-deep exhaustion. He rubbed his neck where the phantom itch of the hemp still lingered. Luta stood before him. She did not care about the blacksmith watching from his forge or the shopkeeper peering through the glass window. She reached out and took Elias's large, battered hands in hers. Her grip was iron. "You are a fool," she said, but her voice lacked its usual fire. It was soft, trembling with the aftershocks of terror. A giant, stubborn fool. "I reckon I am," Elias said, his voice raspy, "but I am a breathing fool." The twins, Two Elk and Little Bird, pressed against his legs. They did not cry. They had passed beyond tears into a kind of fierce, protective vigilance. Two Elk held onto Elias's buffalo coat as if he were holding up a falling wall. Major Vance sat on his horse 10 paces away. He looked diminished. A man who had played a high card and lost the pot to a pair of children. He snapped his fingers at a lieutenant, who trotted over with a leather satchel. "Sign it," Vance said, pointing to the document the Reverend Cole was still clutching. "Sign the transfer and get them out of my jurisdiction. If I see any of you within 20 miles of the fort, I will arrest you for vagrancy." Reverend Cole brought the paper to a rain barrel that served as a makeshift desk. He dipped a quill in a travel ink well. Elias signed his name. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization of what he was signing. He was not just putting his name on a paper, he was putting his name on a future. Vance signed below him, the pen scratching violently against the parchment. He tore the copy off and thrust it at Elias. "Take your victory." "Trapper," Vance spat. "It will not keep them warm when the snow comes. It will keep them free," Elias said. "And that is enough." Vance wheeled his horse and galloped out of town, his column of soldiers falling in behind him. They rode with their heads down, stripped of the glory they had marched in with. Elias looked at the paper. It was a flimsy thing, stained with ink and dirt. It granted legal guardianship of the minors known as Two Elk and Little Bird to Elias Thorne. It listed Luta as a parolee under his care. It was not equality. It was not justice. In the eyes of the law, Luta was still something less than a full citizen, a ward to be managed, but it was a shield. It was a wall between them and the school that stripped souls. "We cannot stay here," Elias said, tucking the paper into his tunic pocket. "The town is ashamed today. Tomorrow, that shame will turn back to anger." Luta looked around at the storefronts. She saw the faces in the windows. Some nodded stiffly, acknowledging the humanity of the scene they had just witnessed. Others stared with cold, hard eyes, hating that a white man had stood with a native woman against the law. "We go to the high country," Luta said, "where the air is too thin for hate." They needed supplies. Elias had emptied his pockets to the commander days ago, but he had a few coins left hidden in his boot. It was not enough for a wagon. Reverend Cole cleared his throat. He was a timid man who had found a spine for 1 hour that morning, and the effort had left him sweating. "Elias," the Reverend said, "I have a small buckboard wagon behind the church. It is old, and the axle creaks, but it will hold, and I have a sack of seed corn. I cannot pay you." "Reverend?" Elias said. "Yes." "Consider it a loan," Cole said, looking at the twins. "Or consider it penance. For the times I stayed silent when I should have shouted, they spent the afternoon preparing. They bought a few basic tools, an axe, a spade, a bag of nails, from the blacksmith, who charged them half price and shook Elias's hand with a grip like a vice. "Good luck, giant," the blacksmith said. "Keep them safe." They left Bitter Creek as the sun began to dip below the western rim. Elias drove the creaking wagon. The roan gelding hitched alongside a sturdy mule he had traded his last good knife for. Luta sat beside him, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the horizon. The twins sat in the back, nestled among the blankets and sacks of flour, watching the town disappear into the dust. The journey to the new home was not a flight. It was a pilgrimage. They traveled north and west, pushing away from the established trails, away from the army supply lines, into the vast, indifferent heart of the territory. The land tested them. It threw spring storms at them that turned the trail into a river of gumbo mud that sucked at the wagon wheels until the mules screamed with effort. It gave them rivers swollen with snowmelt, the water gray and roaring, where Elias had to wade chest deep to guide the terrified animals across, while Luta held the twins and prayed to the spirits of the water. They passed through other towns, small scabs of civilization clinging to the mining districts. In these places, there was no memory of the gallows speech. There was only the raw prejudice of the frontier. In a settlement called Iron Ridge, they stopped to buy salt. Elias walked into the general store, Luta trailing a step behind him. The storekeep, a man with a face like a dried apple, looked up from his ledger. He looked at Elias's size. Then he looked at Luta. "We don't serve Indians," the man said flatly. Elias stopped. He placed his hands on the counter. The wood groaned under the pressure. "We have money," Elias said. "American silver. Don't care if you have gold dust," the man said. "No Indians. It scares the decent women folk." Elias felt the old rage uncoil in his belly, hot and familiar. He imagined reaching across the counter, grabbing the man by his stained collar, and throwing him through the window. He saw the violence play out in his mind, satisfying and bloody. Then he felt a hand on his arm. It was Luta. She did not look angry. She looked bored. "Come, Elias," she said in clear English. "The salt here smells of rat. We will find a cleaner place." She turned and walked out, her head high, the fringe of her dress swaying. Elias looked at the storekeep. He leaned in close. "You are lucky she is a lady," Elias rumbled. "Because I am not." He followed her out. They bought salt from a freighter on the edge of town who didn't care who he sold to as long as the coin bit, but the encounter left a taste of ash in their mouths. It was a reminder that the paper in Elias's pocket could protect them from the army, but it could not protect them from the small, casual cruelties of men. They pushed on. The landscape changed. The sagebrush plains gave way to pine forests that smelled of resin and damp earth. The mountains rose up, jagged saw teeth biting into the blue sky. The twins grew tougher with every mile. The terror that had haunted their eyes in the winter began to fade, replaced by a watchful competence. Two Elk learned to handle the reins of the wagon. Little Bird learned to read the signs of the land, how the turning of the aspen leaves signaled a storm, how the jaybird's call meant a bear was moving in the brush. They were no longer refugees. They were travelers. One evening in late May, they crested a ridge. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. Below them lay a valley. It was not a large place. It was a bowl of green, ringed by granite peaks that still held snow in their crevices. A creek wound through the center, braiding itself into silver knots. There were stands of ponderosa pine, tall and straight, and open meadows yellow with arrow-leaf balsam root flowers. It was wild. It was isolated. There were no wagon tracks leading into it. Elias stopped the wagon. He set the brake. Luta stood up on the bench. She looked down at the valley. She took a deep breath, tasting the air. "There are elk here," she said softly, "and clean water. No soldiers." Elias said, "No roads. It is a good place." She said, "They camped that night by the creek. The water was so cold it made their teeth ache. But it was sweet. They slept under the stars, which seemed closer here, pinned to the black velvet of the sky just above the peaks." The next morning, the work began. They did not build a fortress. They built a home. Elias felled the trees, his axe ringing out in the silence like a bell. He was a man of 50, but his strength was undiminished. He hewed the logs square, notching the corners with precision. Luta worked beside him. She stripped the bark from the logs. She mixed the mud and grass for chinking. She showed the twins how to gather river stones for the hearth. It was back-breaking labor. Their hands blistered and calloused. Their backs ached until they could barely stand upright in the evenings. But there was a joy in it. For years, Elias had only destroyed beaver, wolves, men. Now, he was creating. Every log he lifted was a promise kept. By late summer, the cabin was finished. It was small, sturdy, with a roof of sod that would bloom with wildflowers in the spring. They built a corral for the horses and the mule. They turned the earth in a small patch of meadow and planted the late turnips and potatoes, hoping the frost would hold off long enough for a harvest. The seasons turned. The aspen turned to gold, shaking their coins in the wind. The first snows dusted the peaks. They settled into a rhythm. Elias set a trap line, but he did not trap to empty the valley. He took what they needed to trade for flour and coffee and cloth. He rode into the nearest town, a 3-day journey, twice a year. Luta made the cabin a world. She tanned hides to make winter coats for the twins. She taught them the stories of their people. In the evenings, by the firelight, the cabin filled with the sounds of 2 languages. Elias taught the twins to read from the Bible Reverend Cole had given him. Luta taught them the songs of the morning and the songs of the naming. They were a family stitched together from scraps. But the stitching held. The love between Elias and Luta deepened in the quiet of the valley. It was not a loud, dramatic thing. It was in the way Elias carved a new handle for her scraper without being asked. It was in the way Luta warmed his side of the bed with a hot stone before he came in from the cold. There were still nights when the shadows returned. Luta would wake up gasping, dreaming of smoke and screaming horses. Elias would bolt upright, his hands clawing at his throat, feeling the phantom rope. In those moments, they did not need words. They reached for each other in the dark. The touch of skin was the anchor. They reminded each other that they were here. They were warm, and the door was barred. Their intimacy was a reclamation. Every time they held each other, they were stealing a victory back from the world that had tried to kill them. Rumors of them drifted through the territory. The story of the giant trapper who traded his life for 2 native children became a campfire tale. Some men spat when they told it, calling Elias a race traitor, but others, men who had seen too much blood and too little mercy, told it with a grudging respect. When Elias rode into town to trade, He still felt the eyes on him. He saw the mothers pull their children closer. But he also saw the occasional nod from an old-timer on a porch, a silent salute from one survivor to another. The twins grew like the pines. 2 elk stretched out, lanky and strong. He had Elias's quiet way of moving and Luta's dark, fierce eyes. He could put an arrow through a rabbit at 50 paces. Little Bird was the quick one, the one who laughed loud and ran fast. She had a memory that held everything, the plants, the tracks, the words of the books Elias read. They did not forget the gallows. They spoke of it sometimes, usually in the autumn when the light turned that specific, aching gold. They remembered the day their small voices had stopped a hanging. It gave them a strange, sturdy confidence. They knew their lives had been bought at a great price, and they intended to be worthy of the receipt. One evening, 3 years after they had come to the valley, Elias and Luta sat on the front step of the cabin. It was October. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and curing grass. The sun was going down behind the western peaks, setting the clouds on fire. In the meadow, 2 elk and Little Bird were chasing the horses, trying to bring them in for the night. Their laughter drifted up on the wind, clear and bright. Elias packed his pipe. He struck a match on his boot heel and held the flame to the bowl. He puffed smoke into the cooling air. "They are getting big," Elias said. "2 elk is wearing my boots. He will be taller than you," Luta said, smiling. "He eats like a wolf." Elias watched the boy vault onto the back of the roan gelding, riding bareback with an easy grace. "I worry about them," Elias said. "The world ain't getting softer out there. Luta, the railroad is coming closer. The towns are getting bigger." Luta reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were rough, scarred from the work, but her touch was gentle. "The world is hard," she said. "It will always be hard, but they are hard too. They are ironwood. You helped make them that way." Elias looked at his hand in hers. The skin of his hand was white, scarred and weathered. The skin of her hand was copper brown. They looked right together. "I think about the trade sometimes," Elias said quietly. "I think about the man I was before I found them in the snow." "What do you see?" Luta asked. "I see a ghost," Elias said. "A lonely, angry ghost." He looked at her. The last light of the sun caught the silver threads that were beginning to appear in her black hair. "I got the better end of the deal. Luta, I traded a ghost for this." Luta leaned her head against his shoulder. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass, bringing the scent of snow from the high peaks. It was the smell of winter coming, but it held no fear for them now. They had wood in the pile. They had meat in the smokehouse. They had the paper in the tin box. And they had this. "We carved it out." "Elias," Luta whispered. "Yes," Elias said, wrapping his heavy arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against the chill. "We did." They sat there as the sun vanished and the first stars pricked the violet sky. They watched the children running home through the twilight, their figures dark against the gold of the grass. The valley was silent around them, a fortress of stone and shadow, holding them in its cupped hands. It was not a perfect peace. The world outside was still grinding forward, full of greed and noise. But here, in the blue dark of the mountains, the fire was lit, the door was strong, and the love they had fought for stood like a rock in the river, unmoved, unbroken, and entirely their own. Thank you for listening to this story of Elias, Luta, and the twins. It has been a long journey from the snowy peaks to the gallows and finally to their hidden valley. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in the mountains, the city, or somewhere across the ocean? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. Did Elias make the right choice? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier, where history and legend meet. Thank you for your time, and until the next campfire, stay safe.